There's this old debate in web development of whether you should use an ORM or raw SQL. And while there's no perfect answer, here's how I would approach it. The first pro of an ORM is that it is easier for beginners to get started with. You don't need to learn an additional language, SQL, and as a result you can start, for example, with Rails and use Active Record and get by just fine. It is also simpler to get the ball rolling, especially on greenfield projects that also use frameworks like Laravel or Rails, because those frameworks already have an ORM built in and it is very easy to get started with. The cons are, first, it is hard to adapt to complex constraints, the usual fight against the ORM, which is something you've probably encountered if you've ever built more complex web applications where you're trying to adapt your code base to the ORM instead of the other way around. At the beginning, it all seems perfect, the ORM helps us make things easier, but with more complexity, that stops being the case. Also, it is an over-abstraction in most projects, since it is simpler to have a mental model where we go from the arguments to the query and then the results, instead of having to pass through many layers of abstractions of a language like PHP or Ruby. The pros of SQL are, first, it gives us more knowledge of what happens under the hood, and as a result, you become a better web developer since you understand what actually happens when you run a SQL query. It is also a simpler mental model, like I've just mentioned, we go from the arguments to the query and then to the results, instead of having to pass through many layers of abstraction. It also gives us more control, which can lead to more performance, but it doesn't necessarily mean it always will, because it also depends on the web developer's understanding of SQL and making queries more performant. The cons are more boilerplate, since we don't have all the complexity hidden away from us inside the code base. This can also be seen as a pro since we have more control over what's happening, but for most web developers, this is a con since we prefer to write less code rather than more code. It also takes more time to set up initially since we don't have the framework around interacting with a database and have to set up most things manually. And what I believe is a better approach is to combine both. Tools like SQLX or BunDB in the Go ecosystem are perfect since they strike a perfect balance between an ORM and simply using raw SQL. We still get the power of running SQL queries directly without all the boilerplate that usually comes with it. For more content on web development, make sure to subscribe and check the other videos from the channel.